Folks, welcome to this conversation about reporting on the aftermath of conflict. I'm Bruce Shapiro, Executive Director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma here at Columbia Journalism School, and also on the advisory board of the Columbia Global Center Amman, which instigated this event along with our colleagues at American University of Beirut. I'll have a few things to say, but first I want to bring up my colleague Paige Arthur, who is the Director of Global Programs for the Columbia Global Centers, who can really pull this together with enormous effort.
Thanks a lot, Bruce. Welcome, everyone. As Bruce said, my name is Paige Arthur. I'm the Director of Global Programs at Columbia Global. I work with all of the global centers around the world. We have 10 of them now, and one that is emerging. The global centers, as I hope you know, they're the gateways to Columbia University's local partnerships around the world, facilitating social impact research, global student experiences, and engagement. And I'm really, as Bruce mentioned, I'm here to represent our colleagues in Amman who are not able to make it today. But our Global Center in Amman is one of the co-organizers of this event tonight. So of course we're here to gain insights and learn lessons about reporting in the aftermath of conflict. And unfortunately, this is a topic that is always timely and for which there's always value in reflection and inspiration, because the stakes are so high for societies grappling with the legacy of war. I come from the field of conflict prevention and peace building, and we often wonder in that field, what does aftermath mean? What is after? And we have a whole architecture of language to describe pre, during, post-conflict phenomena, and then we have a set of institutions that match those. But the reality is that the words rarely line up with people's lived experience and the messiness of the world. And in fact, it's a disorienting place that's somewhere always between pre, during, and post. And so what I will say about the aftermath of conflict is that it's typically a space in which not only lives and buildings have been destroyed, but norms of civility, bonds of social trust are profoundly broken. And this is why journalism is so important. The work of journalists tirelessly over years, even decades in some societies, it's essential to any effort to rebuild trust in the aftermath of war. They ensure that light is being shed on stories of the most vulnerable, but also shedding light on those in high positions in their actions and responsibility. Their work is part of a process, a social process of acknowledgement, of recognition, and these are symbolic acts, but they're really essential to coming to terms with the past. So this event, Reporting in the Aftermath of Conflict, is the first of a 4-part series that's being curated by the Amman Center and by the American University at Beirut. And it's about how different professions can engage productively in the aftermath of conflict in these highly fragile and sensitive contexts. So there's going to be further events in April, May, and June dealing with things like the humanitarian aid sector, psychology and trauma clinicians, and also transitional justice. And I also want to just mention another important journalism-related event coming up, which is a major 3-day series in April that's being organized by our Paris Global Center in partnership with the J School and Le Monde, the French newspaper. So this is a curated event that will revolve around the theme of journalism in crisis. And it's going to create a space to explore some of the most critical questions facing journalism and journalists today. So please look out for more information about that. Just to end, I want to acknowledge individually the team in Amman who worked so hard on this event. There's our director, Hanya Salah, and then also Ahmad Al-Musa and Dana Bibi. I'd also like to thank Marika Olson, our director of communications. As mentioned, this is a 4-part series. It's a collective brainchild of the Amman Center and the American University of Beirut. So I'm very grateful that our colleagues Tanya Haddad and Amanda Fox from AUB could be here to join us. Janine, Elana, Nora, we're so grateful for your presence here to share your insights and lessons learned. And finally, Bruce, we are really grateful for your partnership, not just with Amman, but with other global centers as well, the Paris Center. And a big thank you to you and to your team, including Crystal Grow. So with that, I'd like to hand it back to Bruce Shapiro, Executive Director of the DART Center. Thank you.
Thank you, Paige. Again, for those of you who just came in, I'm Bruce Shapiro, Executive Director of the DART Center for Journalism and Trauma, which is a project of this institution, Columbia Journalism School. But we are brought here tonight under the auspices of Columbia Global Centers, and particularly the Global Center Amman, in partnership with AUB, American University of Beirut. I'll tell you a little bit about our panelists in a minute, but people with an extraordinary range of experience during and after war to help us illuminate this time. It'll be very conversational. They'll each talk for a little while, maybe say some things among ourselves, and then we'll go to questions from all of you and continue the conversation that way. Before I launch into my little welcome and kind of framing remarks here, though, I do have 2 pieces of housekeeping that are really important. One is restrooms. There is a women's room at the far end of the hall on the right, and a all-gender restroom halfway down the hall, also on the right. Secondly, this event is being recorded for future streaming. You can see the cameras up there, which means, officially speaking, that by being present in this room, you acknowledge the recording and give your permission to be visible, perhaps, in that recording. And it means that when we go to ask questions, don't say anything that would embarrass your grandmother, because you don't know when they'll see it on YouTube. We're here, we've convened here, all of us, at an extraordinary and difficult time in the world. We are in the middle of norm-shattering conflicts in the Mideast. In Ukraine, there's another event down the hall on kidnapped Ukrainian children, all of which are roiling this campus, which are roiling our societies, and indeed are profoundly disturbing to all of us who think about the world, all of you here. We're also here, though, as people with a certain amount of privilege. We have the privilege of living in safety. We have the privilege, some of us, of being affiliated with a university. We have the privilege of some measure of distance from these conflicts. And in thinking about how to be useful at a time like this, the question comes up, how can we use the privileges that we have in the most effective way? War, conflict, and especially norm-violating violence trap the participants and those closest to it in an essential, eternal present of fear and survival and conflict. And it's very hard to look over the wall, to imagine what comes next. And indeed, I think in all of the conflicts that are going on worldwide now, there's been a failure of imagination, a failure to think about or even articulate a next. One of the things we can do as journalists and as people in allied professions is do a little bit of that looking over the wall, is to say, what can we learn? What can we talk about the future by thinking about the past? by going to past conflicts and asking what are lessons learned that can inform whose stories get told and why, that can inform priorities of news, that can inform how we think about the role of news professionals ourselves, how we think about where societies go in the various kinds of aftermath that follow as hot wars eventually wind down. And it is the accumulated experience with conflict and aftermath here that we're going to draw on today. In this first of, as Paige said, several conversations over the coming months about different professions. We're inaugurating this series here in the journalism school with news professionals, because the question of whose stories get told, how and why, what the news agenda should be, what the safety of journalists means, all of that are central to how these conflicts get eventually resolved. Let me introduce our panelists, and we'll just take it from there. Joined by three panelists here and a colleague from Beirut who are going to shed so much light on this. First of all, in the middle, Nora Boustany, who is a Lebanese-American journalist and educator, known for her coverage of the Mideast and human rights issues. I became aware of Nora's remarkable work when she was in Beirut for the Washington Post, and when she covered Operation Desert Storm, Gaza, Algeria, being based in Beirut, and also throughout the region for many years. She's won the George Polk Award, Distinguished Service Award from the University of Wisconsin at Madison, and teaches journalism at the American University in Beirut. I think we've been the happy recipients of some of her students here who've gone on to careers at Columbia Journalism School. On my immediate left is Janine di Giovanni, who is a past Dart Center Ochberg Fellow, but that's the least of her many achievements. She's an award-winning writer, journalist, who many of us first got to know for her reporting from the Balkans during the most difficult years of that war. She's now the founder and director of the Reckoning Project, training Ukrainian journalists in gathering evidence for war crimes and interviewing survivors of atrocity. And at the far left, my colleague and friend Elana Newman, who is the research director of the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma. She is the McFarlin Professor of Psychology and also on the Media Studies faculty at the University of Tulsa. She's a past president of the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies. She is both a world leader in the psychology of trauma, understanding and treating trauma-related conditions, both for individuals and communities, understanding the nature of trauma and recovery. And she's also someone who has devoted much of her work through her career to understanding and supporting journalists who are exposed to violence, crisis, and tragedy. So the range of experience in the room here is sweeping and wide. I'm going to now move over here, and we'll just have a bit of a conversation. Mic, there it is. Your mics are all on. Oh, my mic is there. I don't need it. Okay. Nora, I'm going to start with you, I think. You, first of all, have reported on so many conflicts and wars and aftermath, including in your own. We each have to turn our mics on. Thank you. You have reported throughout the region and the wider world, including in your own community, place you live, and you've thought a lot about these issues. One of the things I think you and I have talked a little bit of is that there's a kind of set of reporting priorities that change when it becomes not war turns on and war turns off, but rather a winding down of hot conflict to a more frozen conflict or to lower level conflict. how have you been thinking about those? How do you think about those issues? And what emerges? Let me put it this way. I think those of us who are looking at conflicts from a distance see bombs falling, see children die, see armies moving or not moving. It's harder to see what the after looks like. What do we report on? What's the job of journalism? How does it change?
Well,
we
have to focus on the humanity of people. We have to, in our reporting, after an event has happened, after they've been traumatized, have to help them find their way back to a modicum of power. They have lost everything. And our job is to empower them by expressing their suffering, by acknowledging it, as Paige mentioned, by letting them know that they are not Untermenschen, but part of humanity, and that we are interested in what they have to say. And by reporting about them in detail, we kind of redress the wall of lies that have descended on our communities, from politicians, from warmongers, from whoever is leading us blindly into war. And what I like to focus on in my reporting, and which I found was also part of my own survival as a journalist, was the universality of what people have gone through and what remains for them to do in order to be accepted again, but first by their own communities and then by the rest of the world. I remember as a reporter in Beirut, I was a Christian living on the Muslim side. There were many factions, and you end up getting threatened by all of them. And I think my saving grace at the end of the day was that I had equal opportunity threats from everyone. And it taught me something. It taught me that suffering is the same for whoever is going through it, no matter on which side they happen to be on. And I look at what's happening now in the Middle East, and my perspective hasn't changed. And I try to impart that to my students. Forget who you are for a minute. Think about what has happened to the people you have to write about. What standards have been violated? How can we help them heal? Acknowledging their pain. What we're seeing in the Middle East is a lot of pain coming out and biting us, where, because a lot of people have been through so much trauma, and their bitterness and their pain and their dispossession has not been acknowledged. And I'm not only talking about the Palestinians, but everybody.
You became kind of famous as a foreign correspondent for a Washington publication, the Washington Post, as a foreign correspondent, even though reporting on your own home. Many of your students and many of your colleagues are local journalists who are reporting amid societies that have been shattered by war. How is the job different? How are the stories different? How's the work of those reporting locally the same and different from what you would do telling a story for Washington, let's say?
For me, it's always been the same. You are in a context of immense suffering, and you may have a bit of a local perspective. You may feel bad about what's going on. But when I started out as a reporter, the most important thing was getting your story out on deadline. So I didn't have time to dwell on what was happening in my community, but I had the urge, I had a sense of mission. The story has to come out. And when at one point in the war in Lebanon, my editors at the Post said, why don't you go to Amman or somewhere and focus on different things? And I said, but who's going to report on what's going on? You feel that you have to do it. colleagues, we have had Marie Colvin, others who have died and who were targeted. They had that same sense of urgency. Someone has to tell the story. Someone has to kind of be in a way, we are the first respondents to these events before relief workers come, before NGOs come, before doctors come and do their work. We are the first responders in documenting the details of what has happened in order to help communities rebuff the lies. We are also the first ones to acknowledge the pain and help people start their healing process. It is so important, unless people don't want to talk to you as a journalist, it is so important to let them tell their story, to kind of gain a little bit of power when they have lost so much power over their normality, over their familiar lives. And after that, I think people will understand what certain communities are going through, giving less opportunity for politicians with agendas to exploit the pain, and I think that helps bridge understanding in a way. It's essential.
Let me ask you one more thing, picking up on something you said, and then we'll go to Elana. You mentioned your own identity as a Lebanese Christian, right? In your own reporting, particularly once the most fearsome stages of fighting is done, and you're instead looking at correcting the record, at identity, and really engaging with the particulars of the lives of those who've suffered. How has your identity been a strength, been a vulnerability? How do you navigate issues that may arise for you with your identification with folks? This is a very alive issue for journalists today. How have you thought about that? And especially, I'm thinking when you're reporting in your own country.
Well, when I started out as a young reporter, my main goal was to be taken seriously, just like anybody else. I didn't think about myself as a Lebanese covering the Lebanese war, but as a journalist who had the opportunity to write for the Washington Post or for UPI when I started. And so the most important thing was to get the story, to get it right. You know, you reminded me of an example that I feel compelled to bring up. When I was first sent to Gaza, there was a meeting at the home of a Palestinian human rights lawyer, Raji Sourani, and Leah Tsemel was there. And Leah Tsemel, as you know, is an Israeli human rights activist who worked very hard on hearing out Palestinians and what they went through when they were in detention, when they were prisoners. And she came up to me and said, "I'm afraid of what you're going to write." I was sent by the Post to do a series on Gaza in '91 when Hamas had just started building its power, encouraged by the Israelis. You know, they would throw acid into the faces of women. Anyway, a lot of Palestinians were being taken prisoner, and Leah's goal then was to make sure that they were not tried in military courts, but in civilian courts. Anyway, she said, "I'm very afraid of what you're going to write." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because you're a Lebanese Christian." I wasn't an American yet. And I said, "What does that have got to do with it?" She said, I told her, "Why are you asking me this question?" She said, "Look, I'm an Israeli. I'm a good Israeli, religiously, culturally, emotionally, but I want to be a good Israeli. I want to make sure these boys get a proper hearing. But I'm afraid of what you're going to write." At the time, the Christians were anti-Palestinian in Lebanon. And I said, "You know what? I'm a journalist. I want to be a good journalist. I also want to be a good Arab, but primarily I want to be a good professional." That was my answer to her. So
the identity of journalist is one of the identities we carry along with other kinds of identification.
yes, and in my case, it was imperative that I supersede my borders and my own perspectives. It doesn't mean that they don't count in my reporting. I think often they informed my reporting, and they helped sensitize me and my editors and my readers to things maybe other reporters wouldn't have noticed.
Elana, there are a couple things I want to talk with you about, but I think a place to begin is with when fighting begins to die down, when the worst stages of violence are over, and we move into thinking about recovery for a city, a nation, a community that has suffered vast destruction and loss. What do we know now from other conflicts and history about what individuals, families, communities need at that time, and what does that mean for what journalists should be looking at and beginning to report on?
So, first of all, there's usually what I would say is a honeymoon period where you see a lot of working together, and then the fracturing and the real work begins where there's a lot more conflict over time. So that's sort of the general progression. The big issues, and you named a lot of the issues I think already, are about correcting lies, dealing with these issues of universality versus specifics, bringing communities together. I often talk about the dialectic between people wanting information and then people wanting to move on and not think about the past. And there's constant, I call it a dance, between those two. And I think for journalists, finding that right window between what's too much, what's enough, happens at a personal level, it happens in the coverage, and it happens with your sources. You're constantly negotiating, how can I move a little bit into analyzing what's happened without overwhelming, and how can I also look at those things? So I think those are issues. I think all sectors are involved, and that one of the roles that journalists play is really looking at every sector of society and telling the stories of everybody and different views. And that you set the tone. You really set the tone for how things will be covered, your use of language. I don't know how this experiment worked. We were just talking about this. After the Bosnian War, there was a paper who had coverage in two different languages. It's really one using Cyrillic and one using Roman language. Same coverage of different sides, column by column. And I think there's all sorts of issues there to be thinking about. What is it to be community? We know that social support and community is one of the most important things in healing at an individual level and healing at a society level. And what is the role of journalists in looking at that?
I remember being with you in Haiti in 2010 after the earthquake there. This was not a war, it was an earthquake. Devastating earthquake. And we were being driven through a little town, and the only people we could see on the horizon, there was a chair set up, and in the chair was a woman, and behind her was another woman who was fixing her hair. And I had what I think of as the kind of sentimental cornball journalist response, which was, oh God, look at this destruction, it's so pathetic, this is haunting someone in a chair. And you looked at it and you said, no, actually that's an indicator of resilience and recovery. Whether it's for reporters or even as news consumers looking into that aftermath phase, what are markers of recovery that should be in the news but often aren't?
I think it's those little things. It's the first birthday party where there's a cake. There's every one of those moments, those everyday things we take for granted. I was thinking about it this week. My faucet, my pipes froze. I live in Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was hot. It was cold. My pipes froze. And for a week, every time water came out of that faucet, I was so happy. That lasted a week. Now I take it for granted. The water's just running in my house. But it's those everyday moments, and those moments particularly of community. I think of community that you can do an incredible job of highlighting the joys, highlighting those kinds of things. Did I answer you?
What do you, and again, I'll go back to something I was asking Nora. There is a bit of a difference between the job of the foreign correspondent who is chronicling a community's suffering or recovery or combination of those things for the outside world, who's parachuting in, or residing in, but still chronicling it primarily for the outside world, and of local journalists who are, whether they are audio or digital or whatever the mode is, or working primarily in social media, are performing certain critical roles that are different. How do you think about the role of journalism in the recovery phase?
I'm trying to think of an example when I was in Sri Lanka post-war, working with the different communities. And it's getting a little bit confused by also understanding basic journalism. So I'm trying to ferret those things out. But I think the role of a community member as a journalist is really looking at one's community and pointing out the gaps, but also pointing out where things are working. And I think it's particularly complicated when it's your community, when you're talking about the people you love, the people you care about. You usually have a position, and moving to that universal is so difficult. And you're also getting pressure. You're getting pressure from your community to tell particular stories that might not be the stories that are in the best interest of your community, or for accuracy, or for truth. So I really see the role of a journalist in one's community is to stick to the ethics and the principles and the mission. And I also think that sticking to the mission is really important. One of the things we've learned at the DART Center is that sense of purpose helps the mental health of journalists. Having a purpose, and your purpose is so important. It's the reason I'm a journalist ally. I'm in awe. Your role, when done well, it makes a difference. So thank you.
I think also one of the things that I know I learned from Northern Ireland, where I've spent a lot of time, where journalism has played a crucial role in the aftermath of the Troubles there, peace process that now has been going on for a quarter century, has been in laying out lines of accountability and creating a sense of justice when other institutions haven't been able to deliver it sometimes, which, Janine, leads me to you. You've done lots of just straight ahead conflict reporting. You've been there when the guns are going off, but you also have devoted a lot of your reporting to thinking about justice, to thinking about laying out lines of accountability for atrocity, and how that kind of reporting has then played into the aftermath. We were talking earlier about a couple examples of this, good and bad, maybe starting with the Balkans. How do you think about it?
So, is this working?
Yes.
Yes. I've reported 18 wars and 3 genocides. And I know one thing, and that is universally war is horrific. But I also know that wars can either end badly or they can end well. And when I mean well, of course, there's the misery and there's the suffering, but there is also justice. If there is not justice after war, there will never, ever be healing. And there will be war again. So the greatest example for me, I lived through the siege of Sarajevo. When you were talking about the little things, what I remember after the siege, which was brutal, nearly 4 years, no electricity, no heat, and Sarajevo was freezing, no food getting in except humanitarian rations when the humanitarian aid could get in, and constant sniper fire and shelling, was when the war was nearly over and the trams rang, and I heard the tram bell, because for 3 years out my window there were these deserted tracks, and no cars, of course, because no one would dare drive down Sniper Alley. But one day, I heard the tram bells. And it was as surreal as when I turned on the bathtub and water came out, because of course we had no water for 3 years, so no one washed, or you washed in a very original way. But I want to get back to how do wars end badly and how do they end well. In the case of Bosnia, the Dayton Peace Accords were basically imposed upon Izetbegovic, the Bosnian leader. And they were unfair and they were unjust, but the killing had to end. So many people had died. So he conceded a lot of territory and he signed the deal, basically rewarding the perpetrators, the Bosnian Serbs. Justice did not come to Bosnia. Now, it's interesting, when I speak to my prosecutor friends, they always say, but what do you mean? The ICTY, the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, was a huge success. We got Karadzic, we got Milosevic, we got Mladic. And I say, yeah, but 16,000 women were raped, and not just raped, held in rape camps in the eastern part of Bosnia, in Foča, in places like that. Many of them forcibly impregnated deliberately to break the Muslim gene pool. And how many guys, how many people went to The Hague? Barely a handful. So to me, justice wasn't served when one of those women said to me, one of my rapists lives in my village. Every day I have to see this man, and I drop my eyes in shame, not him. I saw so many broken people post-war in Bosnia. The war ended in 1995, but I was obsessed by it, I'll admit it. And I spent years and years and years going back trying to trace war criminals, which was when I first realized that what I really wanted to do with my journalism was focus solely on human rights reporting and on war crimes. And I saw the suffering and the pain that had come out of the war, which really had not come full cycle into a healing. And I'm terribly worried now, as many of us are, I work in Ukraine, but within Republika Srpska, for those of you who know Bosnia, there is trouble brewing. And we are all terribly worried because when I left Bosnia at the end of the war, my Bosnian friend said, see you in 20 years. We will start fighting again. Now, what's a war that ended well? And I don't mean to say that glibly, because no war ends well with thousands of people dead, displaced, ethnically cleansed. But Sierra Leone, I'll give you an example of a small country in Western Africa which endured a horrific war, 14 years, where the main hallmark of the human rights violations were amputations of civilians. The rebels would say, do you want long sleeves, which meant they cut your hand off at your wrists, or short sleeves, which meant they cut you off here. Why did they do this? They did it to instill fear into the community so that these people would be living grotesque symbols of their power. So imagine a landscape of a country where you have amputees walking around, including 6-month-old babies, where people were amputated, where they were brutalized, where they were raped, where their villages were burnt down, and where there were child soldiers everywhere who needed to be re-educated, because one of the things that the rebels did was they took these kids who could be as young as 5 or 6, they made them go back to their villages to kill a family member. Why did they do this? To break the kid's ties with his village, so he could never go back. And that, to me, is what war is. It's not just the bullets and the tanks and the cannons. It's destroying the very fabric of society. So what did Sierra Leone do? It's really amazing, because the war ended when a small group of British soldiers landed, and they basically violated their mandate. They were supposed to be evacuating British citizens. They didn't do it. They said, we didn't go to Sandhurst for nothing. We're going to save this place. They locked down the airport. It was led by a brilliant then brigadier called David Richards, who went on to run NATO in Afghanistan and basically run all the British troops. But anyway, they somehow managed to take this country and begin the process of disarming, begin the process of rehabilitating the child soldiers, begin the process of basically of tribunals and of using different techniques of post-war, like sports was a big thing there. Now, I would say it worked, except that in June 2023, there was an election which was contested, and unfortunately, Sierra Leone is now sliding into fragility of a fragile state again. So my thesis that Sierra Leone was a case study for a good war isn't entirely true. But I just want to briefly, if I can, say what we do at the Reckoning Project, because that was my life's work. My life's work has been tracking war criminals and seeing the bad guys get away with it time and time again, because it takes so bloody long. The ICTY was really started 3 years after Bosnian War ended, but it didn't start investigations. It didn't start looking at witnesses for years and years. So the Reckoning Project was started by myself and Peter Pomerantsev in the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And our idea, and it gets back to your thesis about using local reporters, was that we would train local Ukrainian journalists who are investigative journalists how to be lawyers in a 5-day training. But really, how to recognize what is a war crime, what is a crime against humanity. How do you interview traumatized people? How do you know not to interview children, but to interview the people around them? How do you take a witness testimony that we can use in court to build cases? So we started this at my kitchen table. I was then living on the Lower East Side. And today, 2 years on, we have an archive of 300 witness statements. We work directly with the Prosecutor General in Ukraine. We've submitted to an Article 15 to the ICC. We are leading on the child deportation and kidnapping in Ukraine. We have 30 researchers on the ground, all Ukrainian. And more importantly, we call it quick justice. Because unlike the UN or the ICC, which takes forever to get investigators there, we're very nimble because we don't have paperwork. We just get there, we get the testimonies, we begin to build cases. And then we also do something quite unique, which is we use our archives of testimonies to create journalism. Journalism that will counter disinformation, but also tell the truth, because facts and evidence do not lie. So it's a way of countering the Kremlin machine. My dream, and I was talking to Bruce about it before, is that we bring our methodology, which is unique of the Reckoning Project, to other conflicts where there is massive impunity. So, sorry for taking so much time, but that's my...
Nora, that puts me in mind of something I wanted to ask you. One of the problems of aftermath and of relative peace is that, or frozen conflicts, is that it involves often peace between perpetrators of mass violence. It, in fact, almost always does. And in particular, peace with kind of the major actors in atrocity. You've seen a lot of that in the region, I would imagine. How do you think of that as a reporting matter, when on the one hand, peace depends on negotiations, on in a way, a certain kind of normalization of political leadership of people with a lot of blood on their hands? What's the role of journalism in balancing those competing claims, the claims of a peace process versus the claims of accountability?
You know, this leads me back to the Sabra and Shatila massacres. When we went in to cover what was happening in the camps, I was just a lowly stringer at the time, but I took in a lot of, I went in with Lauren Jenkins, who won the Pulitzer. I went in with Tom Friedman, people from Reuters. And eventually news reached the Lebanese forces, the Christian militias, who were largely responsible for the carnage that took place in the camp. And I was summoned and told, how can you as a Christian Lebanese write and help people write? But I said, we went in, we saw, we reported, we wrote. Who I am doesn't matter. But what I got to do 10 years after Sabra and Shatila is an anniversary piece about what had happened. So I went back to the camp, I talked to a lot of survivors, a lot of families, and I went to all the Lebanese forces commanders and militia leaders who had been suspected of taking part in the massacres, and was able to confront them with a little bit of distance from, you know, the turmoil of 1982 and the Israeli invasion and the assassination of President-elect Bashir Gemayel. And I got some of them to express remorse and regret and feeling. Of course, there were one or two who didn't own up to what they did, but many did, and they felt bad in retrospect. And I had this perverse pleasure of writing a story that kind of probably brought me closure, because it bridged the gap a little bit. It showed, by recognizing their own cruel behavior, they kind of got in touch with their own humanity again. And I thought that was really important. So anniversary pieces are important. You know, do they make a difference? I don't know. What I mentioned in our Zoom call the other day was that finally, after a long distance from what happened during the Civil War, movie directors are beginning to tackle some of the issues that really tore Lebanon apart in the 70s and the 80s, and dealt with these same issues of, and there's one movie that comes to mind, it's called The Insult. It was between a Palestinian engineer and his crew who had come to fix a neighborhood. Balconies were seeping water, and the engineer was Palestinian. The man who kind of rejected the engineer's activities in his neighborhood was a diehard Christian, probably former militia leader. And there was a court case. And these two kind of confronted their prejudices and their pain and their injustices in court as people on polarized sides of the conflict. And then when they left the courtroom, one of them had car trouble, and there were just the two of them in the car park, and they ended up helping one another. And it was a starting point for a healing process, for, you know, maybe not exactly restorative justice, but the movie drove home the point that we can, in fact, get over these big rifts, these big divides, by working together on a common goal. Now, it sounds idealistic, you know, but I think art is kind of the last frontier for the truth, and old issues are being dealt with much more honestly. And I think it's helping. We didn't have a truth commission in Lebanon, and God knows we needed it. But having, you know, seeing that on the screen kind of reminded people of how blind they were in their rage towards the other community, and how easy it was to treat one another with respect, and kind of, instead of having a cycle of punishment, you can have a cycle of healing through activities like this.
And that, what you're saying brings to mind a few things. One is that the arc, the aftermath arc, is in fact very, very long.
Yes.
And has many phases. And there are times when it becomes the work of art, the work of poetry, the work of film, the work of music, in fact, to move where the conversation, where it needs to go, and things that are harder to articulate. But there is also this arc of knowledge, of accountability. And Elana, what do we know about the role of accountability and justice for trauma survivors generally, and, you know?
It's really important. I mean, that's the bottom line. And in simple terms, it's really important for communities and for individuals for there to be accountability. But the side of it is also sometimes there isn't. Sometimes there is no accountability, and communities and individuals need to learn to live with that. You've transformed it in your own way, living with that, into a social action project. But I really think that that is the other thing. As I listen to the hopefulness, I think we also need to remember that some people are not going to take accountability, and we need to understand that and come up with strategies and communicate that and talk about that.
I was really inspired by two things when I created the Reckoning Project. One was the South African Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and the second was the concept of gacaca courts in Rwanda. Does anyone know what the gacaca courts are? I have a lawyer here, probably. Yeah, so gacaca courts were an extraordinary thing. In the aftermath of the genocide, where 1 million people were killed in a summer, a terrible summer, I was there, it would have taken 40 years to go through the entire justice process to make sure that the perpetrators were brought to trial, and that the victims and I hate the word victims, the survivors got justice. So instead, this concept, which is a really ancient, old-fashioned thing, a tribal custom, you bring the perpetrator, the survivor, and the tribal chief in the middle, and it's called gacaca because it means field. And it was literally in a field, and it was a system of local justice, but it was also storytelling. And I didn't realize that to some people, storytelling is not a good thing. To me, in every deep and profound suffering, over the years now, the 33 years that I've been reporting war and working with people who have been deeply affected by war, it is the process of them telling the story, if they want to, because some people don't want to, and if they don't want to, you never ever force them. But most people I've found want to talk about what happened to them because it gives them a sense of agency. And it restores power to them, because the worst thing about war is you are powerless. You have no control over when it will end. You have no control when the electricity will go back on. You have no control over the soldiers that have come to your village and are killing people. And in some way, justice gives people back control because it acknowledges their profound suffering. So I think this whole concept of letting people, it almost is, I remember during the siege of Sarajevo, there was a great psychiatrist doing a study on trauma. And she said, this place is like an open air insane asylum. Everyone here is deeply traumatized. All of the residents of Sarajevo who had endured 4 years of siege. What is the way that they can get beyond it is to talk about it, or to write about it, or to acknowledge it. And that could be film, or it could be painting, or it could be sports, or it could be anything. But you have to get that terrible nugget of pain that comes with war outside of you. So that's what, to us, or for me personally, what accountability can do. It acknowledges the suffering.
I have, Elana, did you have something you wanted to?
I believe all that you've said, but I worry when a journalist's goal is individual healing. So I just want to just put that out there. I do think
a journalist individual healing. What do you mean?
Yeah, I worry. I worry when journalists start seeing their goal is to help one person heal from something. I do think that everything you do helps heal a community, but I worry when I hear journalists saying this is going to be healing for a person.
As in a therapeutic,
therapeutic
when
way.
They take on a project or something.
I'm with you in everything you said, but that came out as you were talking, because I think that's a problematic role, because sometimes the stories you tell aren't healing, and they're not in the service of your source. You don't want to damage them. That's an ethic, but you're not in the service of helping that person. And there are some people, and you said it earlier, who don't want to tell their story, and pushing them's a problem. So I just want to emphasize
No,
that.
absolutely. And also, we're not social workers.
Correct.
You know, I always say that too. I mean, actually, we're not journalists anymore. We're researchers now. We're called. I'm the
You're
Reckoning
Reckoning,
Project.
yeah.
I'm not a journalist officially. I'm a human rights, a war crime investigator.
Forget
So
that. Sorry.
No, and I
Yeah.
do, you know, taking on a project like that, I think would be ethically wrong. But seeing it in terms of we are going to get testimonies that can be used in court, that will help society face what they've gone through. That's more of our personal mandate, I would
Nora,
say.
you were really nodding at that one too. What? Tell me a little bit what got to you in that.
I think I'm speaking from the perspective of a journalist, and I agree with everything
your
Lana
mic up.
said. But
Put your mic up.
Just hold
We
it
just
up.
want to hear every
Here.
word you have to say.
giving a platform to a survivor to express himself or herself and to tell their story, I think is part of healing. That's the only role a journalist can have. We're not psychologists. We can't decide that someone has PTSD. We don't know that. But by offering them a window to tell the world about what happened to them is a way of connecting them to the rest of humanity. That's it.
I agree.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then we'll go to questions from the room. I'd invite you to line up at the mic and be thinking of questions as questions and not statements. Okay. Here's my question for all of you. We actually have circled around again to what the job of journalists is, what the limits of that job are. If from all of your varied experience, you were advising people in this room about what the needs of local journalists emerging from conflict are, how to support them or think about what we're seeing coming at us. Talk about that a little bit.
So, how to support local journalists? I mean,
What do you find when in the countries that you've covered?
Yeah.
Let's say, and when they've gone more into that aftermath phase rather than the hot conflict phase, what is it that local journalists? What's the role of local journalists, and what do they need, both from maybe locally, but from international support or other things too? What do folks need?
you know, I have to go back and put on my journalist hat, but the most important people to me in any conflict, anywhere I ever worked, were local journalists. And you would always find someone that you could work alongside with in a team for many reasons, but mostly because it was a trust factor with the community. I think the most thing, as you were speaking, I just thought, what most of my friends felt when the wars ended and the guns stopped and the UN left and the MSF left was forgotten and abandoned. And the prime example of that is Afghanistan, or Sudan, South Sudan, places like that, which are really off the grid, not Iraq, Syria is certainly forgotten right now. The one thing that I did feel as a journalist, which I did not like, was how fickle the news cycle was. I work in Ukraine right now, and Ukraine was the story for the past 2 years, but it's not anymore. The story is Gaza, as it should be. But I think that we have to remember, for local journalists, we have to keep supporting them. If I was a news editor, I'd be very conscious to put forgotten wars, the frozen conflicts that go on forever. I would give them credence, I would give them space. And also I would think that there's a really important knock-on effect. And we were talking about this as well. I only use Ukrainians at the Reckoning Project. other human rights organizations employ foreigners, but I want locals to do it because I want them to have agency over their justice system and their country, and also eventually to train others so that we leave, and when we leave in 5 years, let's say, we would have, our motto is do no harm, right? But that our researchers will train other researchers and so forth and so on, and soon there will be an effective of human rights reporters who know how to do it accurately without harming people, without traumatizing people, and will get more cases to The Hague.
So actually taking the knowledge and skills that reporters innovated on the fly as they had to under necessity, and saying, how as you're now doing with the Reckoning Project, what can reporters elsewhere learn from this, and so on? That's one thing. What do you think about it?
I think in terms of journalists, we have to teach them how to protect themselves. We have to make them feel heard and seen by international organizations who worry and monitor violations hurting journalists. A few days before I left Beirut, An-Nahar, our Arabic language newspaper, put out a huge supplement of, I think, 6 or 7 pages, just telling journalists what to do in certain situations of danger, how to take care of themselves, how to avoid snipers, how to basically how to survive as professionals but as human beings. And I think it's really important. I mean, I come from a time when I started out as a stringer. The Washington Post had something called the Stringer Fact Sheet. And it basically said, you were an undermensch. You don't have expenses. You don't, you're the slave. Yeah. If you die, we don't care, basically. And you only get paid 5 cents a word or whatever. We have come a long way since then. I mean, now you see organizations such as the BBC, CNN, Reuters, pulling out correspondents or local journalists from Gaza to give them some respite, to give them some time to take care of their families and heal. And I think that's really important.
Yeah. And I think actually one of the kind of evolutions in global journalism since the Balkans is and in some ways it began there, is the rise of a kind of global standard of journalism training, media development, and so on, so that you have local journalists emerging from conflicts as the local correspondents for full-fledged local correspondents for newsrooms which formerly would have employed parachute in correspondents from New York or London. Profoundly skilled journalists who can work across lines of language and culture in very different ways. There's folks from the Balkans, folks from Afghanistan, folks from many countries who now are part of the staffs of major news organizations who wouldn't have been before. Absolutely. That's a big change, right? Elana, what are you thinking?
In addition to those, and I like both of those, I think attending to the mental health of individual journalists. On the one hand, surviving war is it's miraculous that the human body can do that. Like, it's just miraculous. And most people are going to be resilient, but there are going to be ouches, pains, possibly a minority of journalists, but a significant minority are going to suffer from full PTSD. But people are all going to have a vulnerability from the war that needs attention, and without stigma, and really thinking about how we can do that. And in these two, the question that I've been thinking a lot more about is just in general how to support newsrooms in exile. We've moved from journalists in exile to newsrooms in exile, and I think the unanswered question for me is how to support the transition of newsrooms in exile, and I think that's a big question for the future.
Yeah, folks, questions? All right, line up at the mic. How did I know? How did I know it was going to be you? One of my students from last semester. You'll have to turn the mic on. There's a little switch. Just flip it up.
Yes,
Yes,
I am.
there you go.
I'm not just your student, I'm your favorite one.
Is that on the record? Grades are already in. It's fine.
Okay. I really wanted to ask Janine, especially because your work is mainly focused on accountability. How do you think journalists can be able to focus on accountability in wars and genocides where it's been a really long time? For example, I'm in Professor Asmat Khan's conflict reporting class, and I'm particularly looking at Sri Lanka. But the war ended in 2009. But nobody's been arrested for it. There is little to no accountability in that regard. So how do I center accountability in my reporting? What is there like a checklist you keep on what you want to do when you take up those stories to tell?
I mean, one of the reasons why I believe it's so important to begin investigations while the war is going on is because witnesses fade away and they disappear, they die, they become frightened, and the more time goes on, in my experience, the less people want to talk about it because they want to put the war or the suffering behind them. So you're talking about something long-term that you're going back and investigating. I think that my action plan would be, I would identify a particular part of Sri Lanka where a battle took place, and there were many, I know, in the Sri Lankan Civil War. One particular village, maybe. I mean, this is the way I tend to work with micro very much, rather than the whole picture. And I would go find one village, one area, and then I would try to speak to as many people as possible. But I would try to find, and if this is a journalistic piece, you're talking about journalism rather than building a case for the tribunals, I would try to let it be character-led. It's always, for me, for instance, I went back many years after the Bosnian War ended, and I decided to write a story about the man who ran the morgue, because he was the keeper of all of the secrets. He could tell by how many dead came in that night, how they died, where there was a shelling attack, who was hit by snipers. And then one day he was working and his son came in to the morgue on the slab. So terrible story. But it was a very personal story. So I would say to you, identify a geographic location and then try to have as many witnesses, testimonies as you can get, and then, if possible, narrow it down to one character-driven, led story. That's how I would do it.
Nora, go ahead.
Whether you start your reporting right after an event or 10 years after an event, what is really essential is to, by talking to different sources and survivors, reconstructing the event. Even if you have to interview children, what happened, what time, what did you hear, what did it sound like, what did it smell like, what did you see? Reconstructing how atrocities came about is very essential for journalists as well as human rights investigators to get to the bottom of what happened. And you can focus your reporting on a character, which is always a great idea because people identify with one person, or on a place. I was parachuted into Algiers once on a Thursday night at a time when the Fils du Front Islamique de Salut was, or we were told that they were killing people. And Chris Hedges of the New York Times had come in the same night, but he wrote his story in Rome, and then when he was in Algiers, he just slapped the dateline on it. And my editors were furious. What was I going to do on a Friday when the whole town was shut down? So I went to a cemetery and found scores of people visiting the graves of relatives who had just been killed you know, the family of a tailor, the family of a journalist, the family of a barber, family of an actress, all these people who were somehow suspect in the eyes of supposedly the fundamentalist Islamic group. And each of them told the story of their loved ones and how they came on Friday to be with them. So this is how you can do that. In Iraq, you know, when people were fleeing Basra during the Iraq-Iran war, people went to train stations, journalists went to train stations to find out what was happening because people were coming out. So, you know, think of yourself as a barricade and interview people.
And read Anil's Ghost by Michael Ondaatje, because it's a great account of the Sri Lankan war and a forensic anthropologist going back years later and piecing together things.
You know, I would just add to that too, that the need for accountability and the fissures, the mistrust, and the wounds of unaccounted atrocity don't disappear with time.
No.
They remain, the wound remains present, even across generations, not just across 10 or 15 years. In the Republic of Ireland now, there is reporting, the first full reporting being done on a couple of massacres during the Irish Civil War of 1922. Just in the last year, there was anniversary reporting on the Ballyseedy massacre, which was the first full, honest reporting, laying out lines of accountability and opening up a certain kind of conversation that around which there had been vast silence for 100 years that actually resonated out through politics, that resonated out at the community and family level, and people who didn't talk for reasons nobody knew about, that resonated for individual family members of survivors as trauma, right? So the need for a kind of narrative justice doesn't end even when the protagonists die, right? Even when the perpetrators and victims are gone, that need for accountability is still there. Okay.
Thank
So,
you.
and again, folks, as you come, questions, not statements.
Hi, Emre Kuraner, Teachers College Clinical Psychology. I have a question for the panel in general. So when it comes to a journalist's tolerance to violence, would you say it comes from a place of resilience or detachment or both or something else?
I can answer personally, but I do think I was a frontline war reporter, so I was with soldiers in the trenches, saw so many mass graves, was kidnapped several times, had mock executions, and I think at some point I shut down completely. I don't know what I did not have PTSD. I was part of a big study with Anthony Feinstein that took years, and I was one of the few that came out not having it. But I do think I definitely shut down, except when it came to one thing, and that was the suffering of children. I found that unbearable. And even as recently as the Syrian war, I was in a hospital in Aleppo, and not a hospital, it was a triage because all the hospitals were bombed, and doctors were desperately working to save a little infant, and she, in front of us, he was giving CPR, he was doing everything, and she died then and there. And the mother and the father, everyone was in shock, but I burst into tears, and I had to go find a closet to sit in because I thought it was so unprofessional. But we're human too, so the emotional war tears away at your psyche, right? At your soul, because you see man at his absolute darkest and worst, and the things that human beings can do to each other, you cannot believe. So I think that whether or not you detach yourself from it or whether you become numb to it, at some point there's something that's going to break through, and for me it was always children.
Elana, do you want to say something about this?
Yeah, there are a lot of things I want to say about it. First of all, I think that being distressed is not a terrible thing. It's unpleasant, but it means you're a moral, decent human being, and that's okay, you know? But I think we know a lot about what keeps journalists resilient, and I think some of it is the mission. And you hear the mission so clearly on this panel, the mission. Having the support of others. And again, this speaks to what we can do as organizations, what we can do is, with our students, creating communities of support, professional support. I think having a sense of perspective, and some people call it optimism, some people call it whatever, but throughout this, journalists are able to take a position and use all their skills and craft to take a perspective. I think that keeps you resilient and is consistent with the literature. And ethics. Having a sense of moral clarity, and I think it's, for me, that's why I think trauma-informed ethics is so important. And that's what I get the most questions about, too, is really thinking through these ethical issues.
Yeah. Let me just say, we're going to have a hard stop in about 15 minutes. I see there's a long line. We also have to make room for my very important colleague, Tanya Haddad, from American University of Beirut, who's going to kind of get us out of this thing. So let me say, if everybody could ask a focused question, and we'll get quick focused answers from the panel so we can get through the line if we can. But next, so let's,
Thank you.
Nora, did you have something quick on that one? I'm sorry, but.
In addition to the ethics and the sense of mission and caring about children, there are also other factors. When you cover these stories, it changes you. You open up emotionally. You become more sensitive to what others are going through, and you develop a sense of responsibility for not letting these things pass without telling the rest of the world. And another very selfish but very important factor is ego. Journalists want to be in the eye of the storm. They want to get on page one. They're competitive. They want to make sure their editors know their worth. So that's part of it too. And that keeps you going. Had to be said.
It's also why online harassment is wearing on the souls so much more.
That's, yes. So, focused question.
Very focused. Hi, thank you for being here tonight. Even though we're journalists, not social workers, what kind of aftercare should we be striving for our interviewees who have shared their traumatic lived experience with us?
Big question, but see if you can just.
Victims' rights? So actually what we call in NGOs victims' rights, or the journalists themselves?
You should look at the subjects of stories.
Checking up on the subject.
What are our obligations?
In the after, it's people always say to me, you know, what happened to those people you write about? And it is such it's such an accusation in a way, because you know journalists are always accused of being vultures, flying into places, parachuting into places, getting the story, opening up people's lives, and then disappearing. But the fact of it is that you can't really, and this is a really honest thing to say, you cannot, if you've done it, I've done it for 33 years, right? And 18 wars. So, and most of those places I stayed for years and years. I didn't really parachute in and out. But you can't keep track of everyone. But there are people that will remain with you. I mean, I'm in touch with 3 or 4 people in Gaza every single day now. You know, did you get anything to eat? Are your kids okay? How are you getting around? So I think that you can only do what you can do, and I would like turn to Elana for advice on this, because sometimes it was overwhelming for me, and I nearly had a breakdown because I couldn't save everyone. You know, I couldn't get everyone out of Sarajevo. I couldn't get everyone visas to get out of Gaza and to get to England, where they wanted to go to university. And you know, people have said to me, you have to pick your wars and pick your cases in a way. So you can't do everything, but you might be able to help or stay in touch or guide or mentor a few people and change their lives. And I'm not saying that as a god, you know, but as a way of genuinely part of our mission as journalists. Because if we're just here to get on the front page of the New York Times, that just doesn't do it for me at all.
But it's part of it. I just want to add something. By writing about people and what they have gone through, focuses world attention on their plight. And what you can do in your stories at the end is indicate organizations that people can contribute to or be part of to help the survivors.
So essentially it's saying, our job is to tell a story, but here are organizations who can provide care.
People respond. I think back during the 1989 fighting in Beirut, it was really vicious, like 50 shells a minute fell and entire communities were decimated. And there was this little 2-year-old girl called Adele, and I had a photographer with me from Reuters, Elana Newman, who took a picture of this beautiful little girl who was totally pockmarked with bullet holes, and her parents had been killed in one of these battles. And the story ran, and within a week I got a bag of mail this big. And at that time there was no mail, no airports. The mail would come via ship from Cyprus of couples in America, in Great Britain, in Germany, wanting to adopt this little girl, wanting to do something for her and her family. Her aunt refused. But what Elana Newman did just 2 years ago, she went back and looked for Adele. And she's now happily married with children of her own. So telling the story is the beginning of help to these victims.
And I would just add one other thing that has changed, that is new, which is that because of social media and the internet, we also, in the aftermath phase especially, do need to be mindful of the safety of our sources when there may be bad actors who are going to respond to stories that otherwise would have been invisible across the ocean but now are instantly available. So that's something to keep in mind. Yeah. And again, everybody, quick questions, quick answers, panel.
Good evening. My question is about romanticizing resilience romanticizing resilience. So we've seen a lot of that happening. So at what point should the focus shift towards uncovering and reporting on the underlying trauma and story behind this resilient image we always see on mass media, rather than focusing on, a beautiful, resilient image? At what point should we
Elana, why don't you take
go
that?
beyond that?
Because we
think about this a lot. I think that in general in trauma, there's always this dance between wanting to focus on damage and, the beautiful resolution. And they're tropes. There are journalistic tropes. There all of that. And I think that your question really points out we really need to find the way of doing both, because people who are resilient are also damaged. Like, you can have both at the same time. They coexist. And so I think that there's a duty to represent both sides of it.
And I think it also depends on a kind of rigorous understanding of the science of trauma and the science of resilience. As journalists, we would not cover a baseball game if we don't know what innings are and what a home run is. And if we're going to use words like trauma and resilience, we really need to think about what those mean in a scientific rather than a bumper sticker cliche way that stops thinking. Go.
Okay.
Great question.
Hi, thank you. I'm grappling with this one still, so hopefully it comes out smoothly and quick. When it comes to long-term healing from trauma, and you're looking at communities that have gone through it, what's the responsibility of a journalist to try and access, like, we talk about characters and main personal stories that drive these, and what's the responsibility of a journalist to access all the narratives that are available, and what's the dangers of choosing just one, for instance, a survivor's experience versus a perpetrator's experience or the child of a perpetrator?
Janine, do you want to take that?
Yeah, I've had to interview so many war criminals, and there were times when I wanted to reach across the table and strangle them to death. And one time I remember going above Sarajevo to snipers' nests, and being with the Serb snipers, and I was with the British officer, and we were alone with this sniper. He was recovering from his hangover, and he said, "Let me show you how I do it. Let me show you how I do it." And he got his snipers, and because they used to target women and kids crossing the street and hit them in the knees, and we were like, "No, no." And we left, and the British officer was furious, and he said, "I was seriously thinking of killing him, because no one would have known. You were the only witness, and I would have been doing humanity a better job." And I'm just trying to answer your question about how important it is to get both sides. You might not write about the war criminal, or you might not write about the perpetrator, but somehow for me, and I write long format. I wasn't like a news reporter. I wrote very long format articles and books mainly. It was really important for me to understand the psychology. If I couldn't understand the psychology of why people were being oppressive, or why they were acting in such a way, or how they could torture, how they could inflict pain on another human being, I'd have to interview the torturer. And, as a human being, that was really painful, but it was essential to how I wrote my books or my long articles. You can't really do that in a news story as much because you don't have the time or the resources, but if you're doing more long format stuff, I think it's crucial.
Next. Yeah, I'll be quick, I promise. And I know quite, except for you, Janine and I started the dialogue in the Ukrainian Institute. But it's more a form of an invitation. I've been working on a field called reparative justice. And I have quite a few publications that I will actually send you, Bruce, because for Janine, we will continue on that one. And we are consulting the Office of the Prosecutor General with the staff, actually. But I want, because of that, and because we are going to have a webinar with the Prosecutor General and the head of the Victim Witness Section on Monday, I invite you all to the third in a series of webinars on reparative justice. So please come to the website, and you can listen to the former ones and to the upcoming one. Let me give you the website. It's www.ICMGLT for International Center for Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma. Thank you, Bruce, for mentioning the generations. And do attend to it, because what I'm going to speak about in particular is all the ways any human being, journalist, psychologist, anybody, can't listen anymore, doesn't hear.
So thank you, Yael. Thank you. And this is, I should just say that our friend Yael Danieli, who is a pioneer in understanding multi-generational legacies of trauma, and whose work has informed many of our conversations here today. Quickly.
Hi, this is Ilgin Yorulmaz. I'm a graduate of journalism school from 2016, so I'm probably the second most favorite student ever. Thank you so much. My question is, you mentioned, all of you, the identity of a journalist. That's important to give the nuance to the story itself, but sometimes the identity of the journalist or the editor or the publication you're working for is called into question, or even sometimes maybe even putting your fellow journalists into risk. I'd like to refer to a case study, the ethics case study that Bruce was teaching us back in 2016. The New York Times, 2009, New York Times Jerusalem editor is Ethan Bronner, and his son is enlisted in Israeli Defense Forces. So what would you have done if your fellow editor is someone whose son is enlisted in the Israeli Defense Forces, and how would you react now, perhaps? Thank you.
Here's what I would like to do with that one, okay, which is invite the room, the whole room, to think about that one, right? Because in fact, how we draw lines of our own accountability as a profession, where conflicts of interest lie and where they're different are a constantly evolving conversation. And I invite all of you to think about that one rather than to try to answer it here. Last one, go.
Yes.
Quick.
12-word question.
Yes.
What?
This is why.
What do you?
It's enough to get a second question at a press conference, right?
What have you done wrong that you would want the next generation to do right?
Allow a second question. Seriously, that's actually a very, really wonderful question, Nora.
Sometimes, without really realizing it, when you're trying to report and go in depth into an interview with someone who has been through a lot, you may re-traumatize them. And I can think of one instance that I still regret to this very day. I was interviewing a Chechen doctor who was a surgeon, and he had done so much surgery that he developed carpal tunnel in his wrist. He couldn't operate anymore, and he was treating Russians, Chechens, everybody. And he had come to Washington to raise money for a program for treatment for some of his former patients. And at one point, I asked him, what does it feel like not to be able to do what you used to do? And he started crying. And I realized then that I had really re-traumatized him. I felt so bad. I still feel bad about it. It was years ago, and I should not have asked him that question.
Yeah, I have a terrible story as well. In 1999, during the war in Kosovo, I worked for 3 months on the story of the systematic rape of Kosovo women. And my interpreter was a woman who a friend at Human Rights Watch loaned to me. She said she works really well on this, and she'll be great. So for 3 months, we interviewed dozens of women telling us terrible stories of sexual violence. And we were very methodical. We did a great job. At the end of it, my interpreter, fixer, friend, one night had a complete psychotic break. And she had a breakdown that I cannot even describe to you. We got her into a psychiatric hospital in London where she had a serious breakdown and never really recovered. And worse, and this is terrible, my editors, I worked for a Murdoch paper, so that should say it, the Times of London. I wrote a story about the rape, and she said, put me in it. And I said, I have to disguise your name because she was a Muslim woman, and it turned out, the reason why she had this breakdown was because she had been raped many times. So we disguised her name, we gave her a different age, but it was translated by the Kosovo newspaper Koditore. In those days, there wasn't Twitter, but they took the article, translated it to Albanian, and published it, and everyone in Pristina knew who it was, that it was her. So to me, that was terrible and something I live with every day.
Look, I think on these kinds of trauma-drenched stories in the aftermath of conflict, the most profound thing we can do as journalists is go over them, talk as colleagues, as we're doing here, saying what have we done that was right, what are the good choices, what has been challenging, and what have we learned, good and bad, which has been our job here tonight. I want to give the final word to my colleague Tanya Hadid, who I should have mentioned at the beginning and didn't, who has a job I don't envy, better you than me, which is to pull all of this together somehow.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you, our panelists, Nora, Janine, Elana, for sharing your experience and valuable insights. My name is Tanya Haddad. I'm the director of the Global Engagement Initiative at the American University of Beirut. Our main aim is to advance global knowledge by fostering partnerships. At the end of the event today, it's crucial to reflect on the powerful lessons learned today. Reporting in the aftermath of conflict demands not just journalism skills, but also empathy, courage, ethics, commitment to the truth, and justice. Today's event is the beginning of a series of talks on understanding the aftermath of war trauma. Through these sessions, we aim to further the conversation on recovery and the crucial principles of social and transitional justice. The success of this event can be attributed to the collective efforts of a group of people. Bruce Shapiro and the Dart Center, thank you. Paige Arthur, Columbia Global. Ahmed Al-Moussa and Hania Saleh, Columbia Ammal. And Amanda Fox and the team of the communication at the American University of Beirut. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.